A serial predator committed over 50 brutal attacks across California and disappeared for 44 years.
Nobody knew his name. Nobody knew his face.
Then on April 24, 2018, police arrested a 72-year-old grandfather outside his suburban home.
His name was Joseph James D'Angelo.
He was the Golden State Killer. But here's what nobody expected.
The DNA evidence that caught him didn't come from a police database.
It came from a free genealogy website that regular people use to find their ancestors. The investigators had done something that had never been attempted in criminal history.
They uploaded a serial killer's DNA to a public family tree. What happened next changed crime solving forever.
It also sparked one of the biggest privacy debates in modern America.
Because the method that caught D'Angelo could theoretically identify any person in the country through their distant relatives. The Golden State Killer case wasn't just solved by science.
It was solved by hacking the very code that connects all of us. And the story of how they found him is even more shocking than the crimes themselves. Between 1974 and 1986, California lived in fear of a faceless monster.
He struck in the dead of night. He entered homes through unlocked windows. He wore a ski mask. He whispered threats that froze victims with terror. First, he was the Visalia ransacker. Then the East Area rapist.
Finally, the original Night Stalker.
Investigators didn't realize these were the same person until DNA testing in 2001 linked the crimes.
By then, the killer had vanished. The numbers were staggering. At least 13 murders. Over 50 rapes. More than 120 burglaries across 10 California counties. He targeted young couples in quiet suburban neighborhoods. He studied their routines for weeks before attacking.
Detectives collected evidence at every scene.
They had fingerprints. They had shoe prints. Most importantly, they had DNA samples from multiple crime scenes.
But every lead went nowhere.
Every suspect was cleared. The case went cold in 1986 when the attacks suddenly stopped. For decades, the evidence sat in storage. DNA databases like Cody's held millions of profiles from convicted criminals. But the Golden State Killer's DNA never matched. He had no criminal record. He was a ghost. By 2017, the lead detective on the case was Paul Holes. He had spent 24 years obsessing over this monster. He was months away from retirement.
The case was unsolvable by traditional methods.
Then Holes heard about a new possibility. A controversial one. But what he was about to try had never been done before in a murder investigation. Paul Holes learned about genetic genealogy from a retired investigator named Barbara Raventer.
She had used DNA in family trees to identify unknown victims and adoptees.
But never a suspect.
Never in a criminal case.
The concept was simple but revolutionary. Take the killer's DNA. Upload it to a public genealogy database. Find distant relatives. Build a family tree backward until you identify the suspect. It sounded impossible. In December 2017, Holes contacted Raventer with a question. Could she identify a serial killer using only his DNA in public genealogy websites? She said she would try. They chose GEmatch. It was a free website where people uploaded their DNA results from companies like 23andMe and Ancestry. Users could find relatives by comparing genetic markers. The site held about 1 million profiles. Most were Americans searching for cousins and ancestors. On April 6, 2018, Raventer uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEmatch. She used a fake name. The system started searching for matches. Within hours, she had results. The killer's DNA matched 10 to 20 distant relatives. None were closer than third cousins. Some were fourth or fifth cousins who shared a common ancestor from the 1800s. But it was enough. Raventer began building family trees. She used census records. She used obituaries. She used marriage certificates and birth records. She worked backward through generations, identifying every descendant of the shared ancestors. But here's what made this so difficult. A third cousin might share only 1% of your DNA. You could have hundreds of third cousins you've never met. The suspect could be any male descendant in the right age range who lived in Northern California during the 1970s. Raventer worked 16-hour days. She constructed family trees with thousands of names. She cross-referenced locations and ages. After 2 weeks, she had narrowed the list to 2 possible suspects. One had died before the attack stopped. The other was Joseph James D'Angelo, a 72-year-old former police officer living in Citrus Heights, California. What investigators found in his background made their blood run cold.
Joseph James DeAngelo had been a cop during the murder spree. He served with the Exeter Police Department from 1973 to 1976. Then he worked for the Auburn Police Department from 1976 to 1979. He was fired in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer. The timeline matched perfectly. The East Area rapist attacks began in 1976, the same year DeAngelo joined the Auburn force. The crime showed police training. The killer knew how to avoid leaving evidence. He knew how investigators thought. Because he was one of them. But genetic genealogy alone wasn't enough for an arrest. Investigators needed DeAngelo's actual DNA to compare with the crime scene samples. They couldn't just ask him for a sample. They needed to collect it secretly. On April 19, 2018, detectives began surveillance. They watched DeAngelo leave his house. They followed him to a Hobby Lobby store. When he returned to his car, he pulled a tissue from his pocket and threw it in the parking lot. Detectives retrieved the tissue. The DNA extracted from it matched the Golden State Killer's DNA profile with absolute certainty. They had their man after 44 years. On April 24, 2018, police arrested DeAngelo outside his home. He showed no emotion. He asked no questions. When detectives told him why he was being arrested, he simply said, "I have a roast in the oven." Inside his house, investigators found evidence connecting him to the crimes. They found items stolen from victims decades earlier. They found lists of potential targets. They found a hidden stash of personal items that served as trophies. DeAngelo confessed to 13 murders and dozens of rapes in June 2020. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without parole. He will die in prison. But the method that caught him ignited a firestorm. Because if investigators could identify DeAngelo through his third cousins, they could identify almost anyone. Studies showed that genetic genealogy databases with just 2% of the population could match virtually every American to a relative. Some called it a miracle of justice. Others called it a genetic surveillance state. The debate continues today. Since DeAngelo's arrest, genetic genealogy has solved over 300 cold cases. Murders from the 1970s and 1980s are being cracked every month. The technique works because DNA databases keep growing. Every person who uploads their DNA makes their entire family tree searchable. GEDmatch changed its policy after the controversy. Users must now opt in to allow law enforcement searches. But millions have chosen to help solve crimes. The database remains the most powerful tool for cold case investigations. The Golden State Killer case proved that no crime is truly unsolvable anymore. If you left DNA at a scene, you can be found. Even if you never took a DNA test yourself. Even if your parents never took one. Your third cousin's curiosity about their ancestry is enough. Some European countries have banned the practice. They call it a violation of genetic privacy. American courts have upheld its legality. The Supreme Court has not yet ruled on the issue. Paul Holes retired after DeAngelo's arrest. Barbara Ray-Venter continues to work on cold cases. Both say the same thing: this is just the beginning. As DNA databases grow, the technology will only get more powerful. And more controversial. The families of the Golden State Killer's victims finally have closure after 4 decades. But the method that brought them justice has opened questions we're still trying to answer. How much genetic privacy are we willing to sacrifice for safety? Who owns your DNA once it's shared? And what happens when everyone is identifiable through their family tree? The case file on Joseph James DeAngelo is closed. But the debate over genetic surveillance has just begun. And somewhere in a DNA database, the identity of another killer is waiting to be discovered. The question is whether we're ready for what comes next. Subscribe for a new dark truth every day.